Ria, do you have any slides or anything that you need?
No, we do not.
Okay. Ria, do you have any slides or anything that you need?
No, we do not.
Ria, do you have any slides or anything that you need? Folks, if you hear pigging, that's all the staff telling us that we're a go. So this is a good thing. Technology is, knock on wood, not failing us at this moment. So that's extremely exciting. So we will start promptly in about 1 more minute. We'll just give our guests a second, and we'll also um, give anyone who's a little late a second to get on. Thank you. Okay, let's start. I am very excited. I'm extremely excited that we are here and gathered together for this event. And I don't want to, I want to respect everyone's time. So I want to start as early as we can. And also, quite honestly, I'm just excited. So so with that, I do want to take a couple of minutes out to say a few words just to introduce this experience that we're going to have. And I want to say a few words of thanks. To start, one of the things that I've heard as we were preparing for this event is that people were not quite clear as to why we would be doing this kind of event. I think most people supported it. Most people were very interested, but there were a few people who were curious about why Literacy Council Montgomery County would embark on this kind of experience. Like, what was the connection to our work? I think mostly the question was an innocent one. They just couldn't see the link. But I think there was also a sense among some people that this was a change for us. This was a departure, and they wanted to understand why we would do it. I can speak for most of the staff. I think all of the staff, honestly, we're almost all of us have been teachers or are still teachers. I think the first thing that comes to my mind, honestly, when I say this is an extension of our work. Who better than a bunch of teachers to broach difficult conversations that challenge people. It's what a teacher does. It's what what we're meant to do. Which is not to say that we have all the answers. It is only to say that it is our jobs to start conversations, to challenge people into thinking about things in different ways. And that can be something more simple or basic, like how do you add fractions, or how do you conjugate a verb? It can be a little more challenging and understanding some historical moment or the Constitution or something. But it can also be broaching difficult, fraught conversations for the purpose of helping us all see things more clearly. So I think we are in the profession of doing that. And I think this is part of that kind of work. Specifically, though, I'd go even deeper and say, as adult education providers, we work with the underserved. It is by definition the communities we serve. And if we're being honest, and I think we need to be honest about these things, people are underserved for a reason, right? There's lots of reasons for that. But at some level, right, some of that is bias, this systemic racism issues that we all have to kind of work through. Some of that is there. And so the people we work for are often ignored. They're underserved, and so they're ignored. And they're, even on a good day, they're vulnerable. And with COVID raging and with our economy maybe not quite doing as well as we'd like, you can see it even more now, right? Those people who are vulnerable are now crossing over, and they're also marginalized. So who better than the people who work with and for them to advocate, to help amplify and empower, to help amplify voices as well. That is part of our work as well. And that is what we're trying to do here at Bridging the Gap. So now, all these lofty words are nice, but they don't get you where you need to go. They take work. And this leads me to saying some thank yous. First and foremost, staff, all of you are on the call. I know some of you are helping me out, spread across our different platforms, helping me with comments and chats. Some of you are just participating by being on the YouTube live stream with everyone else. And I can't thank you enough for everything you do day in and day out. They help to make this kind of event possible. And I am honored to be part of that LCMC family with you all. I do want to, although I could sing everyone's praises, and I would love to, I do want to point out one person in particular who exemplifies the kind of dedication we're talking about. Her name is Maureen Johnson. She's on the call with us. I don't want to embarrass her, but even last week, she had some health issues, was in the hospital, and still was trying to update me daily on how we were doing with Bridging the Gap. How many people were signed up, how many people were coming. I can't tell you, that's the kind of dedication that is what you hope to have in someone you work with. And it is matched by every other staff member we have at LCMC. So thank you to them. Connected to that, obviously our board, Ria Cohn, our president, thank you for your leadership as always. Marty Blank in particular, although I thank the whole board, but I'm just going to name a couple. Marty Blank for helping make this event even better than it was going to be, and Dee Pinkowitz for starting us out down this road. It was your idea. Thank you so much. And of course, I'm going to thank all of you who are listening and watching and came on a Thursday night. You could do so many things. So thank you for coming and joining us. And with that said, I don't know, Bryn, if you can put it up. I don't know, Bryn, if you are around. If you can't, so one thing to say to you, it doesn't matter. One thing, I'll bring this up at the end, but remember, if you have any questions, if you're on the YouTube, live stream and you're not signed in, you certainly can. Obviously, if you are signed in, you can leave a comment in the chats. But if you're not signed in, you can leave send us an email really quick. Just take a second, send an email to this equity@lcmcmd.org. Someone is staffing that, and they'll be reading those questions and sending them to Bryn so we can share them with our speakers today. If we don't get to the question today, believe me, we promise we will respond within a week. Okay, so let's keep the conversation going. Let's look at that site. And this leads us to, last but not least, to our amazing guests, who thankfully I'm done speaking for the most part. I have to say a few words at the end, but for the most part, it's now my turn to turn this conversation over to two amazing thought leaders. Dr. Roper Ned is a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force at UMD. She also is Assistant Director of the McNair Scholars Program, where she specializes in recruiting and retaining traditionally underserved populations into the university. She has a PhD from Howard, and it has been my amazing honor to have her on the board here at LCMC. We thank you, and we are lucky to have you for all that you bring to us. And her partner today is Dr. Van Patterson. He is a director of programs for the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics. He is also an assistant research professor in the Department of African American Studies at UMD. He holds degrees from Berkeley and a PhD in African and African American Studies from Harvard. And as I joked with him when we started the call, he's a fellow Southern Californian, at least that's where he started. And though he is not a member of our board just yet, we can always hope, we are very lucky to have him as well. Ria, thank you so much. Why don't you take it over?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Gabe, and my partner tonight, Cameron, Dr. Van Patterson, for joining me and for joining us in this conversation. As Gabe mentioned, I am a staunch advocate for educational equity. And in everything that I do in my academic and professional career, I believe it's reflective of that. At the University of Maryland, I've been working with students who have been underserved to really help them earn their PhDs and to prepare them for that journey. The courses that I teach also focus heavily on marginalized populations and educational development. And even my personal life, my partner, Dr. Stacy Brown, and I, we work with an organization by the name of Equity Access Leadership. And we truly are helping educators to prepare and to serve students who have been underserved. So with that being said, the biggest acknowledgement I'll have to say is to the board and to LCMC as a whole to be brave enough to bridge this topic and to have these conversations. I'd love to thank my family, my husband, Wilton, my sons, Christopher and Noah, who are always there, but also everyone else on the online community. And specifically, I'm referencing my family, my parents, who are in Trinidad and Tobago, and I know that they're joining us here. But just want to say thank you for all of those who continue to support us and all of those who are here to engage in this conversation, because this is meaningful, not just as an individual on an individual level, but it's a societal level. And we'll get into that. Another acknowledgement, of course, is my partner, Dr. Cameron Van Patterson, who, when I was asked to lead this discussion, I thought it was most important to not only have him here because of the wealth of knowledge that he holds, but because the conversation truly does address what Wilkerson speaks and references to as the subcaste or the lower caste. And all of those things, the policies that she references, has come to have a residual effect. Although they are no longer here, they continue to affect persons of color, and particularly Black persons, but specifically Black men. And so as a mother, it's really critical to know and understand the implications of what Wilkerson speaks of, the subordinate caste and the impact of that on Black men. And so with his knowledge and his expertise and his lived experience, I'd like to welcome Dr. Van Patterson, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ned, for having me. And I want to thank Gabe, our host, and LCMC for putting this together and for really taking the critical step to have these conversations about justice, about equity, about diversity and inclusion, and what that work really looks like in real pragmatic terms. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. in response to this really, I think, important seminal work by Isabella Wilkerson, who I think this book is going to be taught in universities and discussed for some time to come. And so it's great to have an opportunity to discuss it today. I just briefly want to thank my own family as well, and really just say to all of you who are working from home in some cases, parenting from home during this pandemic. I know this is a very stressful and difficult time for the world. And I think, if there is anything positive, it's been that we can now connect much easier virtually in these kinds of spaces. And I think taking the opportunity to do this and to have these conversations and transcend some of the boundaries that might normally prevent us from all coming together in this way is a good thing. And so perhaps this pandemic creates that space for us to do that and be more intentional about that. I want to thank my family as well. I think some of them might be joining from California, Gabe. So there's some folks from the West Coast here, and I have to give a shout out to my elders, to my mother, because it was actually my mother who told me that I needed to read this book. And so in many ways, Roberta Patterson is responsible for this. So, but I'm looking forward to the conversation and welcome questions and dialogue on this important topic.
All right, thank you. So as we commence, as Dr. Van Patterson stated, the book that we read, it's Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and it really speaks about the origins of our discontents. And so as we are stepping into this space, I'd like to let you all know and challenge us that we, both Cameron and myself, are stepping into brave spaces also, and we will encourage you to do that. We will encourage you to lean into the moments of discomfort and really work to become comfortable with discomfort. Please know that we are speaking from our own voice. We are not representative of an entire group, but rather speaking from our own experiences. I'm coming to you tonight representing so many identities. I'm an immigrant, I'm a woman, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a Black woman in America. And so we need to know that the voice that I'm speaking with and the perspective is coming from those multiple lenses and those various lenses. The book was heavy. It was a heavy read for me because, again, I understand the implications of what it was saying and who it was referencing. And in the end, it was the subgroup or the subcaste or the lower caste. What Wilkinson did is that she shared with us how intentional the US system has been created, how intentional a very rigid, fixed structure of casteism can be applied, not just in a historical context, but to today, we're seeing the residual effects. It persists, this casteism persists. And so while we are here and taking these brave steps, it's also very heavy to understand why we are experiencing what we are experiencing. And so I'd like to ask you, Cameron, can you just share with me some of your big picture perspectives on the book, your initial interpretation of the read?
Absolutely. This is a very difficult book, I would agree, to read. I found myself pausing and reflecting at various points throughout, and Wilkerson poses a lot of really, really thought-provoking questions that force us to look in the mirror and to challenge the dominant narrative of our history in this country. And so I want to start by putting the book in context a little bit, and I want to talk about a work that was published by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who in 1936 wrote, "It is not possible to break caste without annihilating the religious notions on which the caste system, is founded." Now, Ambedkar is a name that we should be more familiar with in the context of our history of social justice movements throughout the world, but He was a scholar. He attended Columbia University Law School and was a contemporary of African-American intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and others. And he set out to defy the caste system in India. And as you all know, one of the major projects of this book is this comparative analysis of caste, sort of historically and geopolitically, looking at the case in India, in Nazi Germany, and in the US. But in some ways, this story begins with the caste system in India, which is of the three, so the oldest. And just to provide a little bit of context, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was born in 1891, died in 1956. He was the first highly educated, politically prominent member of the Hindu untouchable caste. He wrote The Annihilation of Caste for the 1936 meeting of a group of liberal Hindu caste reformers. After seeing a draft of the speech, however, the group revoked their invitation. And so this has become a famous speech that was never actually delivered. And it was recently published as a book, The Annihilation of Caste, with a brilliant foreword by Arundhati Roy. So it's been given new life. And I mention it because I want to posit sort of an argument this evening that we could substitute in the American context religion for race. And so if I read the quote again, it is not possible to break caste without annihilating the racial notions on which the caste system is founded. I think it helps us understand the way that caste operates in India as part of a religiously inscribed racial social hierarchy, which does include also aspects of sort of colorism, right? And this notion of white supremacy, fallacious as it is. But I think, Ambedkar understood that caste was a system, it was structural. And I think that Wilkerson, her argument about using the language of caste as opposed to language of race or other kinds of ways that we're usually traditionally talk about inequality in this country, it achieves a more of a structural focus, which is what racism really is at its root. And I think we'll get into this further, but the notion of racism as this sort of personal prejudice and animosity is only really one dimension of it. And the overemphasis of that dimension of racism in a sort of classical sense really does a disservice to our understanding of power and relationships of power. And so caste, I think, offers a way of really emphasizing the ways in which racism is systemic and structural, and its history and its origins in the US in slavery, in racialized slavery, right, of enslaved Africans, which is a very particular kind of form of slavery in the history of the world. And so I really took a lot away from the book. Like I said, she does a marvelous job. As you all know, she has a very literary style. And in some ways, this book defies genre, right? Because it's history, it's comparative historical analysis, but it's also a work of literature, and she does a really great job, I think, weaving in these stories to exemplify, kind of demonstrate the broader history that she's arguing. So I think the book is really compelling, and I've taught it a little. I've taught sections of it this semester for some of the courses I teach on Black politics, on Introduction to African American Studies. And I think books like this are crucial, and conversations like this are crucial because the decolonization of history requires a commitment to promoting critical race literacy and the social awareness that fosters. And so, for this body to say, to have a commitment to literacy is vital in our world today. But to take it a step further, to have a commitment to critical literacy and critical race literacy in terms of understanding how it is we arrive at this point is, I think, equally as important. And so I look forward to discussing the book and to teaching it at the university and for years to come.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to take it a few steps back because we understand that not everyone has necessarily completed the book. And just for us to get back and truly define the language that Wilkerson has given us. And that's what she has done. She's given us language to explain what we are experiencing today. I'd love to stress that the analogy that she's used is this pyramid, this hierarchy. And in the very beginning, it was very bipolar. It was a relationship, almost like a diametrically opposed relationship, where you were either of the subordinate caste or you were either a part of the dominant caste. It was very fixed. But that casteism, or those caste structures, assigned value, human value, and created these relationships between what was normative and what should be deemed deviant. The caste that Wilkerson speaks of really addressed the assignment of rights and privileges and benefits and resources. And so as we are stepping into this conversation, we need to understand exactly how she chose to define caste, how she viewed it, but also understand that there is an interconnection to some extent between caste and race, but there's also a differentiation between class, race, and class. So when we speak about caste, it's fixed. We spoke about race shortly, which Cameron did, but when we speak about class, it's the ability for us the potential for us to earn, ascend, or to rise above these fixed categories that has been established. Cameron, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think that I would agree with your point, and it is important that we don't conflate these terms, which we often do in just sort of common discussions. But fundamentally, and what I like about caste as a concept, conceptually, is that it really, I think, brings together race and class and demonstrates that they've always been interconnected. Speaking of the U.S. context, you know, the concretization of a racial hierarchy in you know, colonial Virginia, right, in the 1600s, you know, is immediately takes place within the context of the enslavement of African peoples, right? And so the construction of race, the construction of Blackness, the social construction, the political and economic construction of it, is immediately associated with status, right? With being free, being enslaved, having access to wealth, having political rights, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so from the very beginning, one can't speak about these two notions, race and class, are inextricably linked. And in creating and constructing Blackness as a status of bondage, whiteness is constructed as well. And I think that, you know, part of what this project is about, and part of what I think is necessary, as I alluded to earlier, is the abolition of whiteness, right? And that's not to be confused with the abolition of white people, right? But what I'm talking about is the annihilation or the dismantling of caste, of a hierarchy that fixes all of us in certain positions and attempts to delimit possibility for human potential. And so I think when we dig into this further, it becomes very clear as you read through the book that race and class have always been bound together. And I think if we limit our analysis of social history to one or the other, which is part of the story that we've been telling ourselves, we miss the big picture. So that's what I would say there.
All right, I'd like to challenge us now to jump into contemporary times and to understand how is caste perpetuated today, especially in this era of our multiple pandemics. If you can address that, and then I'll hop in and speak to some other components of it.
Sure. So just going back a moment to, the subtitle of the book is The Origins of Our Discontent. And so I want to take a second to just share a little bit about a court case in July that took place in colonial Virginia in 1640, right? And Wilkerson alludes to this in the book, but there's a little more detail that I'll just briefly provide. In a racially, and this is from a book by Charles Cobb called "This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed," which is another book that I encourage you all to read. But in a racially significant decision on July 9th, 1640, in their sentencing of 3 indentured servants who had run away and been recaptured in Maryland, the Virginia Council and General Court ended the fiction that Black indentured servitude was anything less than slavery. One of the servants, James Gregory, was a Scotchman. Another, Victor, with no last name given, was identified in court minutes as a Dutchman. Another, John Punch, was a Negro. Gregory and Victor were sentenced to 30 lashes with a whip, and their servitude was extended by 4 years. Punch, however, was sentenced to indentured servitude for the rest of his life. And then the author goes on to describe sort of in great detail the significance of that, and also the way in which race was used by the planter elite, right, to control and suppress populist movements. And that's a story you can reference Bacon's Rebellion, film The Free State of Jones on Netflix kind of deals with this topic. But there has been this long history of the way in which racial politics and whiteness has actually been used to prevent working class people, to go back to this point about class, from seeing their common interests and advocating on behalf of those interests. And so I think there's a really important story in American history that we just don't tell, we don't talk about, we don't really fully understand critically. And so I think it's important that we begin our history, and the telling of our history, where it actually begins in 1619. And Nicole Hannah-Jones with the 1619 Project and the curriculum around that is I think doing some important work in that area. One thing I want to say as well about this book that strikes me is some of the questions that Wilkerson poses. She talks about the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, and asks the question, what would it take to be the man in the crowd, not saluting, the Hitler regime? What would it take to stand against the sort of tides of history when we've seen, Nazi Germany, the rise of these charismatic genocidal movements led by charismatic figures. And there are just a number of realities that I think we have to confront, particularly in the current moment. And Wilkerson says, and this just struck me, that no current day adult will be alive in the year in which African Americans as a group will have been free in this country for as long as they have been enslaved, right? That will not come until the year 2111. So I mention that because I think it's important that we understand that, as Faulkner and James Baldwin have said, the past is not the past. The past, we carry it within us. The inventory of traces in our ancestors, in our stories. And so I caution us against kind of projecting American caste and racism into a distant past. I think the current political moment and the climate evidence the fact that a lot of the challenges that we like to think of as being ancient history are actually quite present, quite current. And I think the questions that we need to ask ourselves, that Wilkerson's asking in this book, are in some ways even more salient than they were then. And so one of the things that I'll just mention before I stop here is what does it mean to relinquish, to denounce race itself, right? Or to transform it in ways so that it's not predicated upon negation, not predicated upon the dehumanization of the quote unquote other. Because when we realize the caste system for what it is, we then have to become responsible for that knowledge. And I think we have to realize that we are all one, right? To the extent that I have committed atrocities and genocide and human rights violations against people of another caste or people of a different race or religion, I have done those same things to myself. And I think that's the real issue that we have to come to terms with in this country. As James Baldwin said, we can no longer afford the romance, the particular romance that is whiteness. Whiteness is an invention, okay? It is not real. It is a construct. And the construct victimizes people at the lower ends of the hierarchy, but it also victimizes white people themselves. And so we have to dismantle that. And until we do that, we're going to continue to have crises and to have, be in this place dealing with these issues as we've been dealing with for the past several months in this country.
What I recall Wilkerson saying is that no one is immune to the experience of caste. And it's not historical, right? It's current day. It's a part of our culture, for better or for worse, more so for worse. It's cultural at this point in time because we continue to receive messages that lets us know what categories and or descriptions or definitions have been assigned to a particular caste, your subordinate or your dominant caste. The messaging lets us know who is expected to be where, how they should behave, what the boundaries are, the enforcement of the boundaries, but it also brings to light those with power and privilege, those who have the ability to define, to name, to establish the laws and the policies, and to sign the rights and privileges. What happens today, although we no longer have the laws, we are experiencing the residual effect of these laws, is that on an unconscious level, we are experiencing these biases. We are aware of these biases, meaning that we are responding in an automatic way to some of these signals that have been sent to us through our society, our social construct. So we respond to what we believe is a norm. We respond to the messages that dominant caste have created. And very often, and Wilkerson mentions this, the subordinate caste, 1/3 of the subordinate caste, 1/3 of Blacks holds biases against themselves, which I think was quite interesting. W.E.B. Du Bois speaks of this concept of double consciousness. And when he uses that, or when he speaks to that, he references that Black folk are able to view the world through a dual lens, through the lens of a Black person, through my lived experience as a Black person. But we're also able to shift that perspective and understand how white, or the white world, or the white perspective is on Black folk. And so once we're able to assume that understanding, as Du Bois mentioned in his concept of double consciousness, we realize that it's not just a conscious piece, but we too, Black folk, the subordinate caste, we are beginning to respond in an unconscious way to those very same messages that are anti-Blackness, that those messages that hold us back. But this is because it's now cultural, right? It's not historical. We are still dealing with the effects of it. I'd love to hear a bit though about not just the unconscious piece, but I know we talked about the terror of enforcement. Wilkerson speaks about that. We'll shift to that in a moment, just to talk about where and how you see it specifically today, as we talk about police brutality, because I think it's really critical. What comes to mind is a Trayvon Martin case and Zimmerman. So I'd love to hear your opinion on that, and I'd love to chime in on how you feel about the role that Zimmerman plays in this scenario.
Sure, yeah, and I'll just, I'll tilt my screen a little bit here because I did intentionally wear my Black Fathers Matter t-shirt today. And the reason I mention that is because I'm a father and I have a 2-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. And, Wilkerson spends some time in a book talking about what she terms the subordinate parents, right? Parents in the subordinate caste, right? And what's commonly referred to in this country as the talk, right? And most Black people I know, certainly in my own experience, can point to the moment in which they were confronted by what Du Bois calls the veil, right? To go back to Du Bois for a moment, who I think is, arguably the father, or at least one of the foremost thought leaders on critical race theory before critical race theory was a term that came into our discourse. Du Bois was talking about race in America, and in many ways he is the father of American sociology. And of course, Du Bois is a monumental figure, and he is a contemporary of Abdul-Qadr and others. And in fact, when Du Bois dies in Ghana in self-imposed exile in '63 is the moment where Dr. King is giving his "I Have a Dream" speech. And then of course, Dr. King travels on a sort of pilgrimage to India, as Wilkerson documents in I think chapter 3 in the book. And he has a moment of realization that he too is part of the lower caste, right? And is introduced to Dalit communities in India as such, and has to kind of pause and realize that, and then identify with that, and realize that he is part of that. The Black experience in America is not just limited to the U.S., right? There's a global experience of colonialism, right? Of structural violence, and that the fight, the civil rights movement, is really part of a larger human rights movement that involves so many people throughout the world. And so there's a long story there. And Toni Morrison, who passed recently, talked about in an article called Home, that I recommend to folks, in an anthology called The House That Race Built. At the end of that article, she describes Du Bois' theory of double consciousness as a strategy. And I sit with that because what does it mean to have that dual consciousness, that dual awareness of yourself as a Black person and as an American, and to traverse and to navigate the color line, right? In all the various ways in which we do, to know white America in particular ways that white America may not fully even be cognizant of themselves, right? And then what does it mean to mount the self-defense of one's psyche against the long litany of stereotype, and to resist this sort of inferiority complex that is imposed on people from subordinate caste. And so I think that, the implicit bias question is an important one because it highlights how pervasive and how insidious caste operates. And Wilkerson talks about it as a structure, as the invisible infrastructure of our society. These sort of supports and structures in the walls, right? That the beams and trust that aren't visible in the house that race is built, but nonetheless, the architecture that actually supports the house itself. And so you find in our history with Dr. King and others, when King became more radical toward the end of his life prior to his assassination in '68, when he spoke out against the war in Vietnam in '67, when he identified and articulated his critique of the military-industrial complex, and the triple evils of poverty, right, racism, and militarism, right? When King began to understand isms as a system, right, to understand caste and to offer critique of caste that went beyond the normative discourse of the civil rights movement, he became a threat to the caste system. And many argue that his assassination was in fact because he began to critique and apply the American government, and he began to critique racial capitalism, the Jim Crowism, right? That was an evolution from racial slavery, right? And I think the critique of the economic dimensions of racism in this country, in particular, was perceived as a threat. And so we know how that ends. But King was consistent in his ethics, and he sought to apply nonviolence writ large, meaning nonviolence too often is only spoken of in the context of Black protests for justice and civil rights. But and those who promote nonviolence as a form of protest often stop short of applying that same ethos to US foreign policy, for example, right? And so I think we have to really understand the ways in which caste, members of the subordinate caste, whether it be India, the US, or Nazi Germany, are policed. The sort of structural violence, the domestic terrorism, right? That is used to keep them in their place, to fix them within that caste hierarchy, because caste requires someone at the bottom and someone at the top, right? And I think that in reference to Trayvon Martin, I think of Trayvon Martin and we talk about saying her name, saying the names of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Orlando Castillo and on and on and on, the endless litany of people who have been dehumanized by the police state in this country, right? I gave a talk a little while ago on a podcast called Perspectives on Justice, and I was discussing with the police chief the issue of defunding the police and what it means to reform, transform, right? Because I think the question has to be raised is whether or not the system that we've created can really be reformed. I think it has to be fundamentally transformed. And I think that the police violence, state-sanctioned police violence, the murder of Black people with impunity by the agents of the state is a structural and systemic issue. And Mike Pence can deny that all he wants, but the reality is that we are living this experience in this country today. And people who deny that reality are choosing to willfully, right? It's one thing to not know, right? It's another thing to know and choose not to see. And I think that's part of what we have to confront today in this sort of morally relativistic postmodern malaise of alternative facts, right? Where people can kind of find news and media that fits with their political ideologies, right? And so we have to find a way to connect with one another and to dissect and really understand these issues. Trayvon Martin was a victim of caste. He was a victim of the dehumanization, the criminalization a priori of Black boys, of Black men, of Black people, of Black women as well. And he was assailed by a person who understood the caste system in a particular kind of way, right? Who although he was not white, he understood what it meant to engage in the practice of whiteness, to engage in the policing of Black bodies, right? And to assume criminality, right? And so the stand your ground law that George Zimmerman, mounted as a defense for his murder of Trayvon Martin was never applied to Trayvon Martin, who really defended himself, right? Who was being attacked by Zimmerman. But that got lost in the discourse because of our history and because of things like the Dred Scott decision and the Fugitive Slave Act before that, which deputized white citizens. And so fast forward to more recent events and we see, all of these sort of examples over the past several years of people calling the police on Black people for essentially existing, right? Starbucks, walking your dog in the park, whatever the case may be, numerous examples. And now that they've been caught, some of these cases, incidents, as you will, or really a pattern of social policing of Black people, of racial profiling, have been caught and have gone viral on social media, et cetera, which has forced a conversation. But these are things that have been happening, right? Just, do you want to go back to Emmett Till? Do you want to go back to, insert the name, the Dylan Ruth, all of these kinds of things have been happening in this country since its foundation.
That's true. That is true. And I think this is what we're seeing in terms of when we speak of this terror of enforcement, especially as it relates to police brutality, we're more transparent now. But what I think is ironic is that there are many instances where the Zimmermans of the world, folk who, again, who is a part of that middle caste, if there's something as such, where he's a Latino, but he understands what his status is and his ability to police Blackness and to infringe upon Black bodies and Black spaces and Black personhood because of his assumed differentiation between himself and the lower caste or the subordinate caste, or more so his assimilation to whiteness. I think that's the critical piece, that we have folk now in this middle ground who are continuing to petition or to work towards distinguishing themselves in any way from the subordinate caste and to assimilate into the dominant caste, because they understand the privileges that it comes with. It understands that they can look at this perceived defacted group and police them and to infringe harm upon them because of their status. But we were talking and we we're trying to talk about exactly how this caste structure continues to perpetuate itself in contemporary America. And I know, Cameron, you referenced a little while ago that it's not historical, right? But there's that intersection between history and what we're currently experiencing. For example, the wealth gap, although no one today can say that they owned slaves, but what we can say is that those in that dominant group continues to be remnants or evidence of the privilege that their ancestors had. So that gap continues to give privilege to those who have inherited the advantages. It has denied Black folk the right to accumulate wealth. For example, if we think about the concept of redlining, where mortgages were not afforded to Black folk in Black communities. And you and I know that home ownership is one of the primary means of passing on that wealth. Well, Black folk were not able to do that. Black folk were not able to own homes, and therefore the cycle, dare I say, the cycle of poverty was perpetuated because there was not the ability to accumulate the wealth. So the dominant caste continued to purchase homes, and the wealth gap just continued to get greater. What I will stress, though, is that also, if I may, reference the employment opportunities, right? Because I think that's critical and that persists today. Employment opportunities and the differentiation between what the dominant caste was afforded and or the benefit of doubt that they were given. And so Wilkinson speaks on 187, and she says the automatic responses, again, this is where we're saying it's cultural. We all understand what it means to be of a particular group or fixed category. So the automatic response contributes to disparities in hiring, in housing, in education, and in medical treatment for the lowest caste people compared to their dominant caste counterparts. And as with other aspects of the caste system, often go against logic. So this she referenced in terms of white felons applying for jobs. They were more likely to get hired over African Americans with no criminal record whatsoever. So here again, we had the policy piece was the ban the box movement, if you recall, where because of the effect of this continued or residual effect of casteism, there was a movement to remove that box on job applications that indicated whether you had a criminal history or not, because the audacity and the cultural piece is that we were hiring folk, white folk with criminal backgrounds, and preference them over those without criminal backgrounds. So let's just talk about that piece in terms of the stereotyping that we continue to have and continue to see. I think you just mentioned, you didn't use the term stereotyping, but I want to jump to that for a moment. You mentioned, I believe you're referencing the Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper scenario in Central Park.
Right.
And that was, if I recall correctly, it was a scenario in which a Black man, Christian Cooper, had requested that the white female Amy Cooper put the dog on a leash. And the stereotyping piece is that Amy Cooper chose to call the police and threatened Christian Cooper, saying, I'm going to tell them that there's an African American man threatening my life, right? So she knew that by using those key terms, the African American man threatening my life, knowingly will conjure that response to folk and respond to her whiteness, respond to the caste in which she has been granted and the privilege that she has been granted.
Absolutely. I mean, in that moment, she is literally invoking the power of white privilege, right? She's invoking the sort of de facto reality, right? What whiteness represents in our culture, and that evocation has a long history, and I think it's something that we have to call out. Right, we have to acknowledge and recognize for what it is, and I think that particular event which I again would say is a pattern, right? It harkens back, it recalls the Central Park 5 case, right? In that same space of New York, Central Park, it calls back to just the history of lynching in America, right? Particularly following Reconstruction. Right, with the Compromise of 1877, the Southern Redemption, right, and the sort of rise of the KKK, and all of that. But it wasn't just the Klan, right? It was just a culture of racism, and it was not limited to the South. Lynchings and race riots or massacres took place throughout this country, and in many, as Wilkerson argues as well. In many instances, the motivation behind lynching was the truth of it was it was used to terrorize people, and to eliminate economic competition, to threaten and intimidate Black people's attempt to constitute freedom and exercise their rights that were supposed to have been granted to them through the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And we know that the 13th Amendment, of course, allowed for slavery as punishment for a crime, which leads to mass incarceration and the buildup of the incarceral state, which is something that is well documented and that we are now dealing with as well in this moment, where the U.S. incarcerates more people than any other Western democracy or comparable country in the world. And I would recommend to people, I think we mentioned Bryan Stevenson's work with the Equal Justice Initiative earlier. Bryan Stevenson has raised funding and has created a lynching memorial in this country. It's the only one that I know of that exists to this history, which is described by historians, by American historians, as the lowest point, the nadir in American history. It was a period of just abhorrent racial violence and terrorism. And there are no words to even begin to describe what lynching in America was. And Ida B. Wells and Du Bois and others and NAACP and many activists for civil rights and racial justice and just human decency spoke passionately about that throughout this country's history. But it's the fact that we would see we would have Amy Cooper, sort of invoke not only race but gender, right? Because we know that the excuse that was given to justify the mass killing, murder, and torture of Black people men, women, and children, was the defense of white womanhood, right? It was the defense of white womanhood that was time and again given as the reason why this sort of mob violence had to take place. Lynching was a form of intimidation. The victims were made an example of in the public square. They were tortured and murdered in a very heinous and public way. So much so, as Wilkerson mentions in the book, the Postal Service had to ban the sending of lynching postcards because that's how prevalent the celebration of these events were. And it's some of the most horrible, some of the most just dehumanizing images that I've seen in my life are not of the victims of lynching per se, as abhorrent and horrendous and grotesque and sadist as that is, but it's the pictures of the people standing around these tortured and mangled bodies, children after church on Sunday, thousands of people gathering in the town square to celebrate this. And I think it points to a level of depravity, but I think the more critical point is to understand, how is it that a people come to such a low place? How is it that the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich come into power, and you get the complicit silence of so many people in an entire country to condone the genocide of Jews, right? And to incinerate people in these camps, right? These atrocities, crimes against humanity, are something that is part of human history. And if we don't deal with caste, if we don't deal with the systems, the structures that have been propped up and promoted and that have evolved, right, and maintained themselves and co-opted even movements to reform and to try and change them, if we don't address these systems of inequality, we will continue to repeat the crimes that have been committed. And I'll say this, as far as understanding the ways in which we are all complicit and have to take responsibility, these crimes against humanity, particularly in the American context, these were crimes that were state sanctioned. They were committed against Black people in this country by state and national government, right? And so we know that a minority of white males actually own slaves during the antebellum era, right? There were, you had to be a wealthy planter elite. Most white folks were not part of that class. And yet they all benefit from the centuries of racial hierarchy, the caste system that kept Black people in a subordinate position, that delimited their aspirations, their opportunities, and prevented them from accumulating intergenerational wealth. And when Black people did manage to succeed, that success was met with violence, as is documented in the book and many of the race massacres that took place throughout this country, where Black businesses and towns and communities were destroyed. The most famous, perhaps, of which is Tulsa, Oklahoma, where bombs were literally dropped, sticks of dynamite were dropped from a plane, which is where the song from the Gap Band, "You Dropped the Bomb on Me, Baby," that's where that comes from, right? And so we are dealing with a moment in our history where many of my students who are in college, who are bright, talented, very, very, millennials, they don't know this history. They've never been taught it until they get to college, right? And so what does that mean to have this sort of collective amnesia about the actual history of this country, right? How can we confront and address something that we are unaware of, right? And so I think there's a real need for obviously education, again, critical race literacy, and begin to understand caste. And as I was reading the book, I just kind of created a little acronym that I thought might be useful for thinking about it. So I wrote, caste is criminal acts of state sanctioned structural and systemic terrorism, torture, and enslavement. Because I was trying to figure out, like, wow, this concept really captures so much of what we're dealing with, and some of it we're still dealing with today, particularly with respect to policing in this country and the ways in which the police have been allowed to operate with impunity. And anyone who would like to read, I mean, there's so many texts I could point to, but there's a really brilliant article called The Avant-Garde of White Supremacy by Jared Sexton and Steve Marinat that deals with policing in this country and the ways in which, and as the FBI have reported recently, and the Brennan Center for Justice has reported recently, many white supremacist groups have infiltrated policing in this country. This is documented by the FBI itself. And of course, if you read Khalil Gibran Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness, you learn that the history of police in this country begins with slave patrols. And so we're dealing with something that was flawed in its foundation, as people like to talk about the original sin of this country being slavery. But our institutions have evolved out of that. And many of them are still reproducing the logic of caste, of racial hierarchy. And so this is a major task that we have to begin to really assess and to dismantle.
You mentioned that one of the most abhorrent aspects of the lynching was not just the lynchings themselves, but really the crowds that gathered to view that spectacle. And that speaks to what Wilkinson defines as the caste piece. What we see with caste, and what I've come to understand, is that we're doing away with that individual notion, right? It's easier to gather as a group, to not be able to be the sole perpetrator, but to be a part of a larger group. So even when we look at the lynchings, that too was complicit with this group think, this collective that is very evident in the caste structure that has been created. So there's that group in terms of the victims, right? They are not individuals that we are hanging, but is a part of this larger group, this subordinate caste. And so I am not infringing upon another human, another individual, but I'm infringing upon a group that is deemed to be subhuman, if we were to think of it in a critical race thought theory, subhuman category. And in the same way, the perpetrators, they too are not complicit, because it's not an individual doing harm against a subordinate caste, but it really is a group. We're all in this together. And you mentioned that with the lynchings, but I think what we're seeing today too, I'm going to jump to the backlash from the Obama election. The backlash is that we are seeing that there's this collective peace that came about with Trump's election, right? What Obama did is that he violated the racial contract. He violated what caste had sought out to instill and to maintain. And so what we saw with Trump is this backlash as a form of resistance. But going back to that collective piece, that collective good per se, I want to point out what we've seen with his supporters in particular, especially those supporters who are of the lower social economic status, right? Where you hear that the Republican, Trump's motives and or policies that may be anti, let's say, universal healthcare, for example, are not in their best interest. But it is more becoming, there is a greater willingness to preserve the good of the group, this perceived or false pedestal that these white folk have been on, in order to ensure that this category or dominance is maintained going forward. And so what Wilkinson uses, she uses the term dominant status threat, right? So the threat that the fear that this dominant status is maybe jeopardized. My status as someone in that dominant group is jeopardized. And so what Trump did, or the Republicans have done, was to evoke that concept of fear, right? And by doing so, especially with the projections that by 2042, that the dominant caste or white folk will no longer be that dominant group, instilled a sense of fear in folk of the lower social economic status and grouping caste. And so they are willing to sacrifice their own interest, right? The individual interests that really speak to them and their needs for the preservation of the larger group, which in and of itself speaks to how deeply ingrained this concept and this practice is. But what it also highlights, I think, and what's very interesting is that there's a falsehood, right? Because there's this falsehood that my whiteness, no matter what my social economic status, still gives me dominance, still gives me ascension and privilege and rights. And those are the cultural norms or understandings or perceptions that we truly have to counter. But again, has been inculcated in our culture and who we are. And so we have to raise question about really how do we do it? How do we bypass these fixed groupings? And I'm just going to raise it right here, Kamala Harris. What do we say about that?
Well, wow. I mean, there's so much there. I think I want to maybe come at that this way. Jane Elliott, who people may be familiar with, she's sort of famous, white woman, tremendous educator. She did an experiment, the eye test experiment, and it sort of became famous. You can't do that kind of work anymore, but she worked with some elementary school students, and she just arbitrarily, as you know, you could pick any human characteristic, right, to then extract some kind of a social hierarchy. But she did the experiment where she told the kids that if they had blue eyes, they were superior than the students who had brown eyes, and then she reversed that, right? And so she kind of documented how, after a couple of days of this classroom hierarchy she created, how the students responded. And again, these are children, right? And so what she found is that they complied with the notion that she gave them. They followed the script that she created. And they began to internalize this idea that, well, I've got blue eyes, or I'm better, I'm smarter, I'm faster, I'm entitled to do what I want. And these other children with the brown eyes, they're less than I am. And so you think about what that does to people over generations of time, what that kind of brainwashing does, because that's what we're talking about here. And in the book, she uses the film The Matrix as a metaphor to talk about caste, right? And then talk about the program that we've been that we're unconsciously participating in, and what it takes to realize that the reality that's been created, the social agreements that we've inherited about race and identity and power, that these things are artificial, that these things are not real. And if you are able to free yourself, right, to come to a level of critical awareness to where you realize and you see the matrix for what it is, now the challenge becomes, well, then what, right? Because most of the people who I'm surrounded with, people who I love, the people who I work with, et cetera, they're part of this false consciousness, this program that we are plugged into. And so, you know, Jane Elliott quote, I want to share a quote that she wrote, that's one of my favorites. And she says, "You are not born racist. You are not born into you are not born racist. You are born into a racist society. And like anything else, if you can learn it, you can unlearn it. But some people choose not to unlearn it because they're afraid that they'll lose power if they share with other people. We, white Americans, we are afraid of sharing power That's what it's all about. That quote to me, I think really speaks to the phenomenon of Trumpism in this country. Because if you think about Trump's, and Ta-Nehisi Coates speaks about this extensively, if you think about Trump's ascendancy politically, his relevance is predicated upon birtherism, right? The racist idea that Barack Obama was illegitimate, that he wasn't born in his country, that he wasn't really an American, right? And by not really being American, it's not even so much a question of his birth, but of his race and of his religion, right? He's the other, right? Despite the falsehood of all of that, it was a compelling narrative that I think reaffirmed the investment in whiteness, right? Which is not just a psychological investment or a social or cultural investment, but it's a material investment, right? And part of the way that caste operates and maintains itself as this matrix is by policing the boundaries of rank, of hierarchy. And so what does it mean when one transgresses those boundaries? For a Black American in the person of Barack Obama or Michelle Obama or Kamala Harris for that matter, to ascend, to overcome all the challenges, to basically defy the system that was meant to suppress and keep them at a lower rank, is to contradict the system that so many decades and centuries of Americans have been socialized on and invested in. So it's as if Barack Obama or Kamala Harris or any Black Jesse Owens, right? Any Black American or person of a lower caste, or Dr. Ambedkar, right? Who defies the hierarchy, becomes a threat to the system that the hierarchy is meant to maintain, right? And so that defiance has to be policed. It has to be curtailed. It has to be controlled and delimited. And so, Trump's birtherism took on a certain level of currency because the person of Barack Obama represented a threat to the racial caste system, to the hierarchy. And were it not for Barack Obama's presidency, were it not for Michelle Obama becoming the first lady, Trump, I don't believe would have ever been taken seriously. I don't think he would have ever become the 45th president of this country. I think the Trump administration's, Trump's presidency Trump owes the presidency to Barack Obama in an ironic sense, because his presidency is a backlash. It's a racial backlash to what Obama's presidency represented psychologically for, slightly less than half this country. I mean, let's just, the last numbers I saw, I believe Trump got the majority of the white vote in this election this year. And he got more of the white female vote, white women's votes, than he did in 2016. Right now, that's after all of the sexism and the misogyny, in the middle of the pandemic, which is, that's a whole another discussion unto itself. After all of that, Trump was still someone who the majority of white people in this country supported. Okay, now I think that really we really have to pause and think about what that means. And I think we have to ask the why question, right? I said to my students, and I'll say now, anyone who voted for Trump in 2020 is a racist, in the sense that that person voted for the maintenance, for the preservation of racial hierarchy, of white racial domination politically in this country. There are plenty of people who will disavow racism, especially in the sort of the way that neoconservatives on the right have embraced this notion of colorblind racism, right? And this notion of race neutrality, and they have taken a very ahistorical interpretation of Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech and used it to promote and perpetuate a very limited definition of racism that really just talks about personal bias and prejudice, right? Which is impossible to prove, right? It's almost impossible to prove someone's intent, right? You know, unless someone defames you and calls you all sort of racial epithets as they assault you, you're going to have a hard time proving a hate crime, right? Because that is the legal threshold, right? That in this country for determining whether or not someone's actually committing a crime, violating your civil rights because you are Black, or because you're a woman, or because you are gay, lesbian, transgender, etc. Right? Rarely does that happen. And so I think we have to begin to adopt a more nuanced and far more critical understanding of what racism is. And that's essentially is what caste is about, right? To your point, the author in the book on page 79 talks about caste as one of the many moments in which she defines it. And I'll just read: caste is structure. I'm quoting. Caste is ranking. Caste is the boundaries that reinforce the fixed assignments based upon what people look like. Caste is a living, breathing entity. It is like a corporation that seeks to sustain itself at all costs. To achieve a truly egalitarian world requires looking deeper than what we think we see. We cannot win against a hologram. Caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefits, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in a hierarchy. And we know that in the US, that hierarchy is based on this notion of race, this social construct, that's based on phenotypical characteristics, and the pseudoscience of eugenics, which was so popular in the 20th century that some of the most brilliant minds in the world were vocal promoters of eugenics, right? And many of the scientific discoveries, the double helix, you know, the people who we credit with all these scientific breakthroughs were eugenicists. They were racist. And in fact, some of their research was motivated by trying to prove that white people were in fact a superior race of people and that Black people were inferior. So this is something that runs so deep in our history, and it transcends every science, every field of study. You know, it is pervasive, it is ubiquitous, and to deny it or to try and say, well, racism is just, you know, personal, interpersonal, right? It's just, you know, we all have biases, yes, is really does a disservice to the notion of democracy, right? You know, The Promise of America, is Barack Obama's recent book, I believe is entitled, or something thereabout, can never be achieved in a state of denial, in a state of delusion. And half this country, essentially in this election, has confirmed what many Black Americans already knew, right? And so what do we do with that, right? You're talking about roughly 72 million people who voted for Trump. And I should also point out that it is in reaction to Barack Obama's presidency that Trump kind of reinvigorated a sort of classical racism, right? A more explicit, more overt, brazen and emboldened kind of Jim Crow Southern racism, right? Good old boy racism, if you will, which had really been eschewed by the conservative establishment, right? The old right had been condemned. The new right and the sort of neoconservative, colorblind thought leaders of the Republican Party in many ways, and throughout this country in recent history, realized that was no longer viable. And so you saw the dog whistle politics of the Reagan and Bush administrations, and Clinton, and because it's not just a Republican. I don't want to give the impression that this is a partisan issue. No, racism pervades America, red, blue, regardless of party. And so I think that we have to really, really understand that. But Trump made no bones about, he ran on racism. He ran from the beginning in 2016 with racist and inflammatory language. And I think the danger is that it remains to be seen whether that will continue, right? Because Trump has captured the Republican Party in this country. We've gone from the old right to the new right to the alt right to what I would call today the cult right, because it's a cult of personality around one person, Donald Trump. And despite him losing the election, he still has tremendous influence, as we see from the amount of votes that he received. And even though the election, as it turns out, was not as close as people thought, the fact that he won as many votes as he did, I think, is a sobering reality that we have to confront. But one cannot vote for you cannot vote for Donald Trump in 2020 and then sit back and say, well, I'm not racist. That is, that is impossible. Right. Regardless of whatever wedge issue you want to point to or say, well, I believe I'm pro-life, or I'm against marriage equality, or whatever or I just think he's good for the economy. Those are all irrelevant excuses in the face of what this person represents. He is a malignant narcissist, and we need to be very clear about that. And he evidences that every day on Twitter, and in refusing to accept the reality that he lost this election. So to support someone like that, who is unqualified for the office wholly and completely, in the face of a pandemic, says something very, very powerful. And I think we ought to really step back and take inventory of what that means for the future of this country, for the future of our democracy, because it is a fragile thing. And I think I would recommend to anyone listening, read these books. Look at The Dying of Whiteness, right? Look at The White Fragility. These are books that really begin to delve into what has to be done. We have to move beyond these constructs, or we will forever be captured by them, and we will never truly be free as a country.
Very much agree with that. Let's talk about, so we understand where we are right now, but as we're coming to an end, I want to talk about where we're going, right? We talked about the historical piece, the origins of this concept of casteism. We didn't talk about it in a global context and in the way in which I really would have wanted us to, but we talked where we are in terms of the political piece and the manifestation of casteism and caste in our contemporary lives and society. But, I want us to start thinking about, how do we become the anti-casteist? And what Wilkerson speaks to truly is that we need to admit our wrongs. We need to have this reckoning in terms of where America has been, in order to go beyond and learn from the experiences of the American society and the foundation in which it has been built, this house that she speaks of, the bones that it depends on, and that intersection between these fixed structures of caste and what she calls the skin of race, right? Caste will be bones and the skin will be race, but they're intersected. There's that intersection that happens, and the concept of race is a way in which we choose to define and help us assign caste. But it's very heavy. I'm ending somewhat where we started, that we're ending in terms of our need to admit where we are in order to know where we are to go, right? So she speaks about the admissions of slavery in America, and she says the institution of slavery for a quarter millennium, the conversion of human beings into currency, into machines who existed solely for the profit of their owners, to be worked as long as the owners desired, who had no rights over their bodies or loved ones, who could be mortgaged, bred, won in a bet, given as wedding presents, bequeathed to their heirs, sold away from spouses or children, to cover an owner's debt, or to spite a rival, or to settle an estate. They, that is the slaves, were regularly whipped, raped, and branded, subjected to any whim, or distemper of the people who own them. We need to come to an admission. We need to come to terms in terms of what our wrongs were in order for us to move beyond this category or this caste structure that we have established and that we are a part of. So in closing, I would love for us to think of this in terms of, again, heading back to where we started, the brave space that we need to get into, the discomfort. Wilkerson says that we can be born to the dominant caste, but choose not to dominate. We can be born to subordinated caste, but resist the box others force upon us. And all of us can sharpen our powers of discernment to see past the external and to value the character of the person rather than demean those who are already marginalized or worship those born to false pedestals, right? So our challenge as a society as a whole is to make ourselves vulnerable, accept the wrongs that we have done, but our vulnerability requires us to ask questions. It requires us to avoid judgment. It requires us to do away with that collective good that we saw when we mentioned the lynchings earlier, because it's only through the individual narratives, the individual experiences that we can truly try to deconstruct a system and a country and a socially constructed system that has now become a part of us. What we're seeing today, I believe, it truly is an awakening. An awakening, we're on the cusp of an awakening in which this subordinate caste has the ability to blur these lines. But what is most critical is that the onus is not just on the subordinated class. And what we are seeing is that the dominant caste, through this awakening or perceived awakening, let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movements, is that we are hearing the voices and seeing the actions of the dominant caste who has now developed a sense of empathy, right? They're no longer sympathetic, but they are stepping into the perceived experience of the subordinate caste. And with that empathy, the experience is now more likely to be internalized and to be understood from the subordinate caste perspective. And only then I truly believe we need to understand our humanity and the individualism that comes with it, and really champion our fellow brothers and sisters as our fellow humans and brothers and sisters of humanity. And so I'm looking forward to what is this next step, what is to come. But we now understand where we have been, and we have to now act. It's really the action that's required going forward. So with that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I would agree wholeheartedly with that. And, look forward to Q&A, but, I think I am optimistic, cautiously optimistic about this sort of multiracial coalition, the allyship. I think allyship is a really important word in this moment. We need to understand our linked fate. As Dr. King spoke, we need to understand that we are really one. Human beings are one species, and the Human Genome Project and all of this sort of genetic science actually that exists today proves that very fact, that race is indeed a fabrication, a construct. And so, as genetic science catches up to sort of spiritual awareness, right? And we begin to understand these things empirically. How does that inform our policy? How does that inform our behavior? I don't think we can afford ahistoricism. We can't afford to be colorblind. Not looking at race, not acknowledging where we are and where we've been is not going to help us solve our problems, as some jurists on the Supreme Court have argued. Roberts and Thomas, have ruled in favor of policies that really are kind of race neutral, and I think that is a debate that needs to be had. But I don't think we're going to evolve as a species if we're not able to confront where we've been and deal with it. And we don't deal with it by pretending it doesn't exist or by ignoring it. And so I think, Brene Brown talks about daring greatly. And this is a moment in which we need to dare greatly. We need to be vulnerable. We need to be known. We need to be honest with ourselves and with each other. And we need to take account. I don't know if we got into it earlier, but one of the tragedies of this administration is the child separation policy and the trauma that this country has inflicted upon untold numbers. I think there are 500 or so families that are still, have not been reunited. The American government, in my view, is participated in kidnapping, right, and in all sorts of creating all sorts of ACEs or trauma, what they call ACEs in the mental health space. For children who have been separated from their parents. Who is to be held account for those atrocities? Right? I mean, what do we as a people say, when do we say enough is enough and we're not going to continue to allow these things to happen? So these are questions that we have to look at. I think the pandemic has exposed also, and in some ways, further exacerbated the racial disparities that are already exist in terms of our social determinants of health and how we understand outcomes, social mobility, poverty, concentrated poverty, lack of education. The metric for the strength of our economy cannot be Wall Street. It can't be, how large corporations are doing. That is certainly one indicator. But we need to rebuild the middle class. We need to understand the reality of that people are living on the ground, regardless of race. And so I think these are big questions that we need to ask. We can't continue to exist and to allow literally this sort of kind of irresponsibility that results in the loss of hundreds of thousands of people during this pandemic. Which is still ongoing. And so we have a lot of work to do, but I think that we can do it, but we just have to decide that we're going to. And so I'm looking forward to moving forward and locking arms with a broad base of people of various backgrounds, whether it be gender or race or religion, whatever creed or color, it really doesn't matter, because as I said, we all have to be enlisted and committed to this process. And white Americans in particular must disabuse themselves of the notion of their own privilege and their own superiority. Because it's one thing to say, well, I'm an anti-racist and I'm not racist. It's one thing for a man as a man. It's one thing for me to say, I support gender equity. I am opposed to sexism and misogyny and equal pay. I support equal pay. It's another thing for me to give up the privileges that I enjoy as a man in a society, right? And I think that is what is required right now. We need people who are in positions of power and influence to think about what it looks like to use that power to transform the very system that has given them this undue influence and undue access and undue resources, right? And instead of exercising sort of this entitlement, right, we need to be going the other direction. We need to be saying, how can I as a man make more opportunities for women, right? How can I as a white person create opportunities for people of color, for Black people? And how can I be, and let's be intentional about it, right? Again, ignoring it is not gonna move the needle, right? We need intentional diversity. We need political inclusion. And I'll end with this. Although I'm relieved that the Biden-Harris campaign won the election, I think Black Americans and all Americans need to hold this new administration accountable for the changes that we want to see. And we need to be aggressive in putting forward the agenda, which is something that I don't think Black Americans did during the Obama presidency for a lot of reasons, in part because of the racism that we knew he was experiencing. But we can't afford to sit back and get comfortable and just say, oh, well, Trump is gone, so everything is well. No, we get to work. And so I'm committed to doing that work.
Dr. Van Patterson, Dr. Ned Ropenet, I do want to just end with one question. I know we're going a little over time, so people who are on the call, I really appreciate it. My camera just went out, so we're losing battery time. So you're just going to have to hear my voice, unfortunately, but that might be okay. We had a lot of questions come through, and I think one resounding like theme that has come in this, and I think you both touched on it already. So maybe just a closing couple thoughts from each of you. It's around discomfort, right? It's about that this is a heavy topic. We know that. And but one question in particular, or one formulation of a question I thought was, I want to honor it by just this by sharing it, because I think it's just a super honest formulation of the question that kind of encapsulates a lot of the other ones that came through. So this question says, this topic makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about it, but I want to help. Is that possible? And I'd want to pay honor to that question, because I feel like that's kind of some of the stuff that I was talking about when I first started, that some of the questions about why are we taking this on? If I really got into it with that person, I felt like a lot of times at the heart of it, it was, I don't really want to talk about it. Do we really need to talk about it? Your literacy council, don't we talk about, fun things like educating people? But at the heart, I think, is this discomfort, right? And there are lots of variants on that question, like how do I talk to my kids about this? But I think that one, I just want to honor that. And I don't know if you have any words for it. I just any reaction to those words, or any thoughts to how we maybe, what can we say to that kind of feeling?
Yeah, I do have to honor that question. I think it's a very real question. I've sat in this today. I actually did a diversity dialogue at the university, and I was in a small group, breakout group, and what I continue to observe is that the onus is often on to use Wilkerson's terms, the subordinate caste, to provide, to almost help the dominant caste, essentially white folk, get comfortable. And part of my challenge is that there is so much weight already in terms of being a Black person in America. There's so much weight that comes along, not only with the lived experience, but the psychological experience that Black folk continue to live with, or persons of color, that what we would say is that at this moment, at this time, and this is when I say we need to lean into that discomfort. It is a difficult topic, but the only way we can get to the core of it is to truly try to empathize. And the only way we can assume that empathetic mode is to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable means to ask questions and to predicate or precede that question with, I do want to learn. I do want to understand. And so in that moment, there is a willingness to be vulnerable, but also a willingness to be empathetic, right? What we need is to have those tools and those persons who will knock on the door and ask a question, or to check in. And again, the admission, not the admission of wrongs per se, but the admissions that I don't know. I don't understand how you feel. And with the onset of George Floyd, I have one colleague, a white female, and she was one of very few who checked in on me, right? And that is what we need to check in. You may not be living in the shoes or have the experience of Black folk, but it is okay to ask. And again, I think when we speak of judgment and avoiding judgment, it goes both ways, from the person who's asking the question and the person who's being asked, and understand that that is how we can grow together.
Dr. Van Patterson, do you have any thoughts to take us home?
Yes, I appreciate the question. And I think that's the kind of vulnerability that we need. We need to be honest about our deficits and how we feel and the discomfort, right? Because this is an uncomfortable conversation. But I think we need to realize that the discomfort we may feel is nothing compared to the cost that we will bear, that we have already borne in this country, that people have literally lost their lives because of this system. This is a wicked, wicked system. It destroys people's lives. It destroys families. And we need to realize that. And I think as a parent, the way I think about it is I can learn to deal with my discomfort. I can overcome my own personal anxieties and fears, right? And I can do it because I don't want my children to inherit the same world that we're living in today. I don't want to have the conversation with my children that about getting stopped by the police, right? I don't want my son to feel, or my daughter to feel, that she's any less than anyone else. And I think that this is a universal desire. All people want to be free to realize their full potential. And these systems of oppression, one of the greatest costs is that they don't allow people to grow. They don't allow people to realize their full potential. I often ask my students, who would Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. have become had he not been assassinated at the prime of his life? Who would Malcolm X have become, right? Who would Medgar Evers have become, right? There's so many people whose lives have been cut short, struggling against these isms, right? And we owe it to them as our ancestors, right? To whether you're Black American, of African descent, or otherwise. I mean, technically, actually, the Black story, that African history is human history. We are all actually descendants of Africa, if you go back far enough, because Africa is the beginning of human civilization. And so again, I would encourage you to be courageous, be curious. So the Judge A.W. Center, where I work, the Policy Center at the university, we focus on education, right, which is about being curious, justice, which is about being courageous, and ethics, which is about compassion. And the Dalai Lama talks about the need for a secular ethics today, something that is not tied to a particular religion, but that is rooted in empathy and compassion. And I think, the curiosity and the compassion are vital, but I think the most important quality or principle is courage. We have to have courage. And a great ancestor, Maya Angelou, talks about courage and being a cardinal virtue that allows for us to do all things, to overcome our fears, and to overcome the discomfort. And so I would just encourage people to be courageous, right? To take risk, right? Because in doing so, every effort you make, every conversation you have, every admission you make, it allows for the world to become a little bit better. And hopefully our children and future generations won't be having these conversations. Hopefully this will be an irrelevant discussion in the future, because we will have evolved beyond this. And if we can elevate human consciousness, in the same way that we approach these global problems of climate change, well, racism and white supremacy is a global pandemic. It's a virus. It's a cancer. It has to be, if we don't destroy it, it will destroy us, And so for me, this is a question of life and death. I don't even have a choice. This is the work that has to be done. If not for our own sake, then for the sake of our children. And so I would just think about the future, think about the kind of world you want to live in. And let's create that world together.
And just to end, I think we need to maintain that silence is compliance, right? And so we do need to ensure that we are disrupting the times when we do hear and or see injustices. And because by not doing so, we may not be overtly or expressively doing it, but we are complying and sanctioning the behaviors that continue to perpetuate this very fixed and just, rigid system of privilege for one group and really pitting another group against each other.
Amazing. Thank you so much to you both. Thanks for everyone who's come to this. I can't think of a better way to spend a Thursday. They're deep conversations, a little bit like church, felt like being in church.
Amen. Amen.
All of experience, one needs to really be deep and think about things. And I'm glad you took me there that Thursday night as opposed to a Sunday. So I appreciate it. We need a little of that. So with that said, I think the only things to end with really are a couple last things to everyone who's still listening. Folks, let's keep the conversation going. We have 3 more of these Bridging the Gap events coming up. It's all in our website. I don't know if Barin can bring it up or not. Barin, if you're still on, it'd be great to put the website up, but it is on our website as well. So if you come to LCMC MD and you look at events, you'll see Bridging the Gap. Really easy email. It's up on the screen right now, btg.community. We've got 3 more talks scheduled for this year, and we're planning for next year. This is, I think, a great experience, and this is such a great first experience. I think this just tells us this is the way we need to keep going and keep growing it. And then we have a podcast coming up, our new episode, which is also called Bridging the Gap, which is runs parallel to this. We have 2 Black leaders in the community, and our very own Denise Hill was on that call. That is going to be dropping on Monday, so look out for that. We'll send an email to everyone who joined us, who signed up. It's going to be really wonderful. I think Barin is kind of showing our website in all of its glory and all of the future events coming and the podcast. So the first one is coming up. We're talking about education and the Black community. We had 2 leaders, C. Marie Taylor on that call, and also Julian Haynes from the Meyer Foundation, both of them along with Denise Hill, who's on staff with us. It's a really good conversation. That'll drop on Monday again. So lots to keep going. Let's keep the conversation going. Please send any thoughts you got to equity@lcmcmd, and please stay safe. I have a favorite podcast, and the last thing they always yell at is, and wear a mask. So wear a mask and try to hold on to some of this stuff that we've got on this call. I think there was a lot. I thought it was going to be heavy on the brain stuff. Let's heavy on the heart stuff too. And I think I think we should hold on to this experience and live with it a little bit.
All right. Thank you.
All right, folks. Have a very, very good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks for everything.